They came with knives of words, and the village smiled like it had a secret. At Sorry Kamara's gate they left a goat and a whisper, "No son." Curse. The goat bleated and the whisper turned into a chant. That night, the moon watched Sorry and Finda sit close on their small porch while the market drums faded away. People thought the hardest thing in the story was the insult. They were wrong. Sorry stood up and cut the cord that tied the goat's basket. He did not cut his family. He tied the goat to the tree and fed it millet. He told Finda, "If the village wants sons, we will give them daughters who hold the sun." Finda laughed until she cried. In that laugh lived the first promise: they would not bow to the weight of other people's words. The promise would be tested, broken, healed, and remade like beads on a string. This is where the trouble starts, and where the story refuses to be small. A house can be small and loud. Sorry's house was both. It smelled of stew and salt, of soap and the sea that crusted Freetown outside their door. The roof leaked a little when the heavy rain came. The floor was packed earth. There were toys, boats carved from orange wood, a cloth doll with one eye. There were voices, Finda's when she hummed at dawn, Sorry's when he laughed at the market, the daughters when they argued who would wear whose straw hat. A child's small hand could make the whole house lean with joy. But outside, the village liked to test men like fire tests iron. They asked questions like knives. How many sons? When will you have a boy? When will your house carry a man's name? They moved like vultures, circling, tasting rumor for meat. Sorry answered in small, patient ways. He fixed a leaking pot with a strip of leather and a joke. He bought 2 extra mangoes at market and hid them in his pockets for the children. He learned how to make a face that told the village, "Go on, speak." He was not afraid to be laughed at. That laughter would teach his daughters a truth they would carry into storms. People will say cruel things to measure a life, but lives are not measured by other people's hands. The first night the chant reached their gate, Sorry and Finda slept with their backs to each other and their hands joined across the thin blanket. They dreamed simple dreams, of clean laundry, of a little school desk, of a bright shirt for the youngest. In the morning, Sorry rose and went to the market as he always did. He brought home not one son, of course, no one brings sons the way they bring bread. He brought home a story. The story said the village had put someone in charge of telling how men should be judged. The man wore a new hat and smelled of authority. Sorry looked at the hat, at the goat tied under the tree, and smiled. He would answer the village, but not with the knife of words. He would answer with a life. Sorry Kamara had the hands of a man who worked with paper and ropes. He was a clerk at the shipping office in Kleintown. His hands folded documents like gifts. He worked early and came home late. He carried the light in his chest like a small lantern. People called him neat because his shirts had no stains, because his sandals were tied exactly the same way, because he swept the dust from the porch in the mornings with a rhythmic patience that made the sparrows sleep. He married Finda under a mango tree that smelled of summer and grief at the same time, summer because there was fruit, grief because her mother could not come. Finda was quiet in a way that did not mean weakness. Her eyes were steady. She could sit and sew at night while the neighborhood argued about tomorrow's rains. The first time she held her daughter, she said, "We will teach her the names of birds," and Sorry cried like a man who had been given a map. Their daughters came one after the other. Each birth stitched the house tighter with love. Each birth also widened the lines that the village kept drawing in the sand. For the neighbors, a daughter was a question mark. Why no son? They asked the way they asked for cola nuts. It was taken as part of daily trade, gossip for attention, insult for conversation. Sorry answered with words that made people laugh but also made them stop. When the market women jeered that he would be the end of his line, he placed his hand on his daughters' heads and said, "These girls will carry our stories." Who needs a line when you have a story that can cross the sea? He made jokes about handbags and weddings, about pads and shoes, but when someone's voice grew cruel he turned that laughter into armor. He taught his daughters to hold their heads like queens and their laughter like a weapon. That way the village could not claim their joy. the daughters learned fast. The oldest, Aminata, had a voice like a bell. People stopped at her singing in the rain. The second, Mariama, could break a dry branch and make a broom that swept whole rooms. The third, Hawa, had a laugh that made dogs sleep. The twins, when they came, were named by Sori with a chest of drums beating time. This one, he said, shall be called Adama. He turned to the second and, in front of everyone, called her Tenji, because she had 10 small dimples like stars. The village muttered. Some said the names were bold. Sori only bowed and said, well, at least we will remember them. The names did not stop the gossip. A woman in the market would comment on the cloth Finda wore, on the hair of the youngest, on Sori's watch. An uncle would say, you should have married a woman from my town, they make sons like mangoes. Even children learned to mimic older voices and repeat the questions. But the household had a rhythm of its own, the morning washing, the midday stew, the evening stories told by the light of a single lamp. In that rhythm, Sori taught each daughter a small skill. Aminata learned to read the shipping papers aloud. Moriyama learned to mend nets. Hawa learned to trade fish so she could bargain with men twice her age. The twins learned to spin stories that made even elders lean close. Word travels in a village like smoke. Sometimes it curls and returns. Sometimes it burns. The village's words returned to Sori in the shape of a challenge. The market women decided to host a contest. It would be the day of drums. If a man's children could present something of value, skill, song, craft, then the man's house would have honor for the year. The prize was not a cow or a palm, it was respect. Sori looked at his daughters and felt a small panic like a stone in his shoe. He also felt a fierce joy. He said to Finda, we will take our daughters to the market. Let the village watch how daughters carry fire. Finda's hands trembled when she packed the small cloths. The twins climbed into the basket as though they were going to war with ribbons. The market that morning smelled of fish and oil and mango. Traders chattered in strings of agreement. A radio played far-off news about ships at sea. The market women wore their crowns of cloth like small suns. They lined up to see who would show honor that day. The contest stage was a plank between 2 bananas, judges sat with clips of paper. People came to clap. The boy who sold sugar near the entrance bet his friend that Sori's girls would bring only songs about rice and broomsticks. Sori walked in like a man with a secret pocket full of pride. He placed his daughters at the center and told them to begin. Aminata sang first. Her song was simple, a tale of a fisherman who mended his net and mended his village with the same hands. The melody found the market like a river finding a rock. People stopped to listen. Some wiped their hands on cloth. Moriyama showcased a net she had repaired in the night. She explained, in short words, how a broken mesh could be threaded with patience and patience could pull a village out of hunger. Hawa came forward last with a game she had invented. Children must cross a small rope and not lose their balance. She turned the game into a lesson about balance in life. The judges scribbled, the market women muttered. When the twins tumbled into a small dance, their tiny feet carved a pattern on the earth. The youngest, Tenji, sang a line that made old men smile and remember their mothers. By the time Sori bowed his head, the market had changed. People traded their jeers for applause. The boy at the sugar stand held his breath and then laughed. Maybe Sori's house will feed my grandchildren, he said, not meaning it at all. But pride is a fragile thing. After the applause, a woman in high cloth, Kumba, who had the voice that carried orders, stood and said, a nice show. Now, where are the sons? Her words were not a question. The market rocked a little. Sori felt something cold crawl along his spine, then a heat that spread from his belly like an ember. He could have answered with a joke. He could have bowed and left. Instead, he raised his voice and said, my girls will feed the market. My girls will fix what is broken. If you want sons, take your goats and count them. The crowd laughed, but Kumba's face did not move. She had been watching men and their houses for 20 years. Sori had made an enemy. Enemies in a small town wear many hats. Some call them firm names like chief or judge. Others hide in gestures. Kumba would pass each time beneath Sori's porch and lower her eyes like rain before thunder. She whispered to market women and they whispered back like boxes of secrets. The contest had won them eyes, but it had not won the long fight. Sori knew the line of things, the way old power clung to bone. He also knew something else, that a story can turn a man into a mountain if his daughters are the bedrock. He gathered his girls and walked home with a basket heavy with mangoes and a new sense of purpose. That night he taught them a song about a woman who planted a baobab and watched an army sleep under its shade. Rumor is a small animal that grows teeth when fed. One evening, a neighbor said a thing that made the hair rise on Finda's arms. They say the man who works in the office keeps his daughters to hide a shame, she whispered. They say his mother left a curse. The rumor put its fingers on things like old stitches. Sori heard it and went to the little shrine behind their house. He did not go to pray. He went to pull a weed. He pulled until his hands hurt. To damage rumor, he thought, you must make true work appear. So he fixed the fence. He repaired the shutter. He took every small duty as if mending could silence the wildest lie. But some stories do not die easily. They find a place to sleep in crowded heads and wake up with friends. One night, a group of men came with a hollow drum that called the town to council. They said the council would meet under the old silk cotton tree. The word had a smell of storm. Sori stood before the council where men sat in wide chairs and in smaller chairs and in cracked stools. Kumba was at the head like a queen who had borrowed a crown. They asked questions with knives disguised as sandals. Is it true, they asked Sori, that your house is different? That you prefer girls? The question was not about truth. It was about punishment. Sori listened. When it was his turn, he told a story. He told of his father who sailed and who once came home with a blue scarf and a small lizard. He told of Finda's mother who taught the girls how to stitch and howl with the wind. He spoke of children who counted stars instead of suns. His voice did not shout. It did not plead. It simply made things small and clear. The council could not hold a story in their sandals. A child in the back fell asleep. An old man began to laugh. Not all were won, but the seed had been planted. Sori left the council and found Finda waiting with rice and the twins asleep on her back. He held her hand, and that night the house smelled sweeter. But the council's doubt did not vanish. Kumba muttered to herself that men like Sori made trouble like a slow leak in a boat. She began to plan. She wrote a letter to a trader in town who liked to buy influence. That trader had ears in the law office. He could press buttons. He could make a small storm big enough to break a window. Sori learned of this and sat down to teach his daughters how to watch, how to notice the small movements of hands, how to count the way a trader's laugh changed when he wanted money. The daughters became watchful eyes, not for spycraft but for survival. They learned how to turn attention into action. A stranger came once, a thin man with shoes too white for the mud of Freetown. He listened to the market gossip like a child listening for a story. He gave Sori a job offer, or rather, the promise of a job if Sori could bring him a favor. The man wanted a paper sign that would let him buy a piece of land by the creek. Sori knew that piece of land. An old widow lived there with a small herd of chickens. The land smelled of cassava and old songs. The man paid with soft words. He said the deal would mean more money for Sori and easier times. Sori folded the paper, smelled the ink, and thought of Finda's hands. The next day, someone found out. The widow's son accused Sori of being part of a plan. The accusation moved fast like a hungry dog. Kumba fed it with questions. The office where Sori worked called him in. Paperwork turned into a storm. Sori's boss, whose face was thin as a ladder, asked for explanations. Sori explained that he had only been given a promise and that his name had not touched paper. The men looked at each other in ways that meant they would choose the easy side. Sori found himself standing outside the office with a packet of papers that smelled like rain but held no shelter. He lost the promise of the job. For a week the house felt smaller, as if someone had stolen the best blanket. Finda did not cry outwardly. She folded rice with hands that shook. The daughters saw hunger in their mother's face for the first time. It was a sharp sound like a broken drum. Sori sat on the stoop and watched ships drift like lazy beasts. He had to find a way to keep the house from shrinking. He had to find a way to turn a lost promise into a road. He called Aminata and told her to read the newspaper aloud. He told Moriyama to mend a net. He told Hawa to sell some fish. He told the twins to gather firewood. They all moved like a small army. When the market noticed their quiet work, something changed. People began to buy Moriyama's nets because the girl who made them had a steady hand. Hawa's fish tasted of the sea and confidence. Aminata read advertisements for a small teaching job and applied without shame. Little by little, their house filled again, not with money, but with the sound of working things being put right. The rumor that Sori accepted bribes lost its teeth as the family did honest work. Kumba was not pleased. Men who liked to watch other men's houses burn were not happy to find the match did not light. The twins, Adama and Tenji, were small thunderstorms in the house. Adama liked to carry stones and give them names. Tenji kept a tiny list of items she believed a true queen should have: a leaf, a bright bead, a coin she had found under the porch. They argued with the older sisters like two small kings arguing over a market stall. One afternoon, the youngest stole the village judge's hat and refused to give it back until the judge promised to tell a new story. The judge laughed and took back his hat and, for once, sat listening to children invent lines that had no need of permission. The eldest, Aminata, blossomed into a leader before she was old enough to marry. She began to teach little children how to read letters on the leftover shipping labels that Sori brought home. The little school was under their porch, and the children sat on turned-over crates. Sori watched with pride that made his chest feel like a drum ready to beat. Aminata's voice made the letters small and bright. People started leaving small coins at the porch. A woman from across the way left boiled yams. The family shared what they had. The house that the village mocked became a small light for neighbors who needed a place to learn. With the light came enemies who preferred the dark. Kumba began to tell a different story now. She walked the market with a long step and told people that Sori's house had grown too bold. A man must have sons to guard his name, she said, and added a smirk that was a blade. She made a pamphlet that asked pointed questions and left it at doorsteps. Children found the paper and read it aloud like a new game. Sori found them and told them the truth: stories and names have power. He taught them how to turn gossip into a riddle to be solved. The children took this game to the market. Instead of repeating Kumba's pamphlet, they made up questions about kindness and trading and the price of a promise. The market songs changed. Then came the night a storm hit the coast so hard it took roofs and patience. The sea threw itself against the land like a jealous lover. The town's creek swelled and swept a small boy's canoe away. People ran and called, and Sori found himself listening to the river the way a man listens to a drum in his chest. He did not think of sons or curses. He thought of the child. He and the daughters ran into the dark with ropes. The twins clung to his legs like vines. Together, they pulled a little boy from the water. The boy's father wept and called Sori a name he had never heard before: brother. News spreads in a village, and sometimes news rearranges the social pieces like a careful hand. The rescue went through the market like fire through dry grass. Hands that had thrown stones in rumor now offered help. After the rescue, things shifted like plates on a table. The man whose canoe had been lost began to bring fish to Sori's porch as thanks. The market women, who had been cruel for long pleasure, started bringing small sacks of peanuts when they had extra. Even Kumba's mouth grew smaller in the market, though she still wore her tall cloth like armor. Sori's girls became known as the ones who pulled a boy from the angry sea. Children started using their names in games. "You are Adama today," a child would shout. "You are Tenji," another would declare. Names like banners flew in the wind. Sori used this new quiet to build. He started a small club at the porch where people could bring broken things to be fixed. A woman brought a mirror with a crack and learned from Moriyama how to line it with cloth so it could still show someone's face. A father brought a torn shirt and left it to be mended. The porch became a place of repair in the town's mind as well as in its goods. People who had once shouted at the house now came with small items of need. They did not ask for justice. They asked for help. Sori charged nothing. He took only stories. The story collection turned into a slow, steady power. It pulled more men and women who were tired of judging into the shade beneath Sori's porch. They shared food and advice. They learned that daughters could read the sea like a song and mend nets like a prayer. They learned that daughters could stand in the market and make men stop with a single line. They learned that respect could be made in small, patient ways. Sori watched his daughters teach each child who came by. He felt pride like a warm cloak. And yet, he knew this peace was a thing that must be tended. Kumba had not yet finished. Power had many faces, and she wore each one. One day a letter came from the shipping office. It said Sori's job was secure. The office had misunderstood the paper and apologized. The news arrived like rain in a drought. The sinners in the market who had mocked him looked at Sori differently now, not because they respected him for his dignity but because they were afraid of being wrong. Sori did not dance on their fear. He used his steadiness to call for a market meeting. He stood under the same old silk cotton tree and asked to speak not as a man who had been insulted but as a man who wanted the town to heal. He talked about the river, the rescue, the small things people could do. For the first time, a few young men stood and said, "We will help at the creek." That night, Sori's porch had more people than ever. Time eats at the edges of everything. Years passed and the daughters grew like long rivers. Aminata became a teacher for Real. Her small porch school opened under a proper tin shed. Children came with chipped bowls and big questions. Moriyama ran a small stall where she sold nets and stitched sails. Hawa turned into a trader who could bargain with men from distant towns and still keep her smile. The twins, Adama and Tenji, were no longer small and wild. Adama taught other children to name stones. Tenji kept lists the way elders kept proverbs. The house that the village once laughed at now made the market pause. Yet people remember their old songs. Old men at the corner still asked about sons like a prayer. A new voice rose, one that did not know Sori but knew the shape of old power. A government man came to town with papers and rules. He spoke of development and roads. The council saw an opportunity to trade land for money. Kumba smiled like someone who owns the tide. She pointed at Sori's porch and said, "They have that corner land. Surely, the town will benefit if we use it." People listened to the promise of roads. The idea of change had a sweetness like sugarcane. But promises are soft and often hide sharp things. Sori went to the meetings and listened. He watched how men shifted chairs to hide deals. The shipping office wrote letters and Sori felt the old tug of fear return. He called his daughters together. He said, "We must protect the corner where the children learn." The daughters looked at him with the steady eyes of those who had already been making the town better. They did not ask for permission. They began to plant a small garden around the porch, little by little, a stubborn border of cassava, peppers, and herbs. They turned soil into proof. They taught neighbors how to plant too. Where a paper might claim a corner, a planted garden makes a living argument. When the government man arrived with his official stamp, the town saw green around Sori's porch. Children tending soil, women carrying water, the children's laughter, these were hard to move. The stamp lost some shine. Kumba was clever. She said the garden looked pretty but could be replanted elsewhere. The city man hesitated. He liked clear maps more than stubborn gardens. Who would sign a paper that wrote over a child's laughter? The man left with a promise to think. In the market, whispers turned into worry for the men who had wanted an easy sale. The small garden had made a big trouble for them. Sori's daughters had protected their place with hands that were ready to work and mouths that would not be silenced. An illness came to the town like a slow thief. It took breath and left coughs that sounded like old wooden doors. People closed their windows and kept their children near. The market slowed. The shipping office posted notices and the city man returned with a wagon of medicines that only some could afford. Sori's neighbor fell ill and the family had no medicine. Sori could have stayed home and closed the door. Instead, he opened it wider. He sent Aminata with letters asking for help at the clinic. He told Moriyama to bring salted water and warm blankets. Hoa walked to nearby towns and traded nets for medicine. The twins ran errands and learned the rhythm of compassion. The town learned that daughters could be healers in the widest sense. Aminata helped the nurse at the clinic count pills and, because she could read, she wrote the names of medicine on a blackboard so people would remember instructions. Moriyama mended torn cloths into masks. Hoa bargained for more supplies and brought back a story of a town that had a surplus and gave it away. The porch became a small triage. People lay on mats and murmured thanks. The mayor of the town came by and watched the daughters work with a seriousness that moved his face. He had been a man who loved titles, but he could not ignore the sound of actual help. Kumba watched this change and could not like it. Her jokes turned sharp. She told anyone who would listen that Sori's house had made the town lazy, that the city man would notice and step in to teach discipline. Her words had the same old tune but were now less convincing. The town had seen hands that healed. The village that once measured a man by the children he birthed now watched another measure appear, what a man's children could do when given space. Sori's daughters had turned their house into a new kind of power, a power that fixed things. When the storm passed and the coughs eased, Sori called a small feast. The market women brought cassava. The mayor offered thanks and gave Sori a small plaque that read, "For quiet courage." Sori laughed and said the plaque would look better hung in the porch where children could touch it. That night, Kumba invited Sori to speak with her in private. She said, "You have changed things, Sori. Some of it is good. But do not think the town will sing forever. Power remembers its old songs." Sori looked at her and said, "Power remembers nothing it has not earned." She left with a low laugh. The threat was not gone. It had, for a moment, learned to move in new clothes. A marriage proposal arrived for Aminata from a town across the river. The man who asked was kind and steady. He had a small shop and a soft laugh. Families talked as families do, they measure, they ask, they look for reasons. Finda looked at Aminata with eyes that were full and did not quite want to let go. Sori sat quiet. He had always taught his daughters to be free like birds and anchored like trees. Aminata asked to stay and continue teaching. The man understood and promised to let her. The village gathered to celebrate, to fold hands and say blessings. They sang the old songs and some of the old men even asked forgiveness for their earlier questions. Yet not everyone was happy. Kumba had thought marriage would be a chance to remind the town who held the ropes. She sent a small gift with an edge. It was a woven cloth that had an embroidered story about sons and long names. She meant it to be a joke. But the bride's family took it as a pinched insult. Sori took the cloth, unrolled it, and laid it in the middle of the porch. He did not throw it away. He sat on the edge of the mat and said, "This cloth will be used to dry hands, not to bind hearts." He asked Aminata to stand and speak. Aminata spoke straight and the whole town listened. She told a story about a teacher in a small room and the children who came like thirsty plants. She told them about reading and counting and the joke about names that made no sense anymore. People clapped. The groom's family nodded. Even Kumba paused. The wedding moved forward with laughter and small dances. The market women sang a new verse about a teacher who gave a child a book. At the party, Sori danced like a man who had learned a new song. He did not hide his joy. He did not need to. The town tasted a small peace. Yet peace is not a gift you keep without tending. Kumba watched the wedding and saw the town's taste for different songs. She began to plot something larger, something that would make the town remember old order. She reached out to men in distant offices and to those who kept lists and stamps. Her plan used small laws and older greed. It used the map of land and the softness of people who wanted new roads. Sori felt the ground shifting again, but this time the ground had an extra weight. He called together the people who had repaired their house at the porch and said, "We must build a roof that cannot be measured in papers." They began to work. A new road promised the town wealth. Trucks would come. Shops would expand. But roads in small towns are like knives that cut both good and bad. They can bring money and they can sweep away gardens. Kumba had long wanted the corner where Sori's porch stood. She thought it was the simplest place to line with concrete and begin a new market. She dreamed in blueprints. The mayor listened because blueprints come with the smell of bills. Sori gathered the town, shopkeepers, mothers, children, and showed them the small garden where the children learned. He told them that a road should serve people, not push them out. Arguments rose in the market like steam. The man who ran the rice shop said he wanted a wider space for trucks. The old woman who sold palm oil said a road would mean good customers, people who would not carry water by foot. The town split. Kumba had already lined up signatures, but Sori had a different plan. He proposed a market council to represent small traders and mothers. The idea was simple: let those who would be affected have the choice. Some laughed at the idea. Others joined. The city man returned with stamps and an impatient smile. He asked for papers that would approve the road immediately. Sori felt the town's future in his chest. He knew how to argue calmly, and he also knew when to let the daughters speak. Moriyama stood before the council and spoke of nets and how trucks would crush the drying fish. Hawa explained how a small stall near the creek brought steady work to women who could not leave children behind. Aminata read a petition they had written with the school children's names at the back. The city man read the signatures and frowned. He could not quite sign away a town that had made its voice loud enough. The mayor delayed. The trucks did not come that month. Kumba was furious. She called a meeting with the men who liked easy deals. She whispered promises of construction and business. Sori noticed that grants sometimes smell like oil and steel and rarely like the smell of cooked cassava. He also knew that war is often fought with money. So he turned to what he knew: stories. He called for a market play where children would act out both futures, the road that cut gardens and the road that worked with people. The play was simple and sharp. It played like sunlight over a map. People watched and their hands went still. A few new voices rose to say that a road should not swallow the porch. The next day, a man with the letters of authority arrived and said the road would be built anyway. He had maps in a leather case. He pointed and names fell like coins. He was a representative from the city, the kind who moved with the certainty of someone who carries a stamp. Sori stood quiet while the man read. When the man finished, the room smelled of ash. Sori asked questions that the city man did not expect. Where would the trucks park? Who would be compensated? How many women used the corner daily? The city man was used to talking at people, not with them. The questions slowed him. Kumba smiled at first, but when the council started to ask for time and a plan, her smile thinned. She wanted a fast sale. She wanted the road to begin before anyone learned how to count losses. Sori proposed a compromise. Let the town determine a buffer, trees, a small green belt, so the children's class could continue. He suggested plans that would make the road useful without stealing the porch. The city man called the suggestion cute and said it would slow the project. Then he noticed Aminata's students with their notebooks and the twins with a list pinned to their shirts. He saw women who had been quiet now holding hands. He saw the town with a face made of small, stubborn things. The man with stamps left with a promise to return with engineers. Kumba clenched her teeth. The market hummed. The children went back to their reading. That evening, Sori sat on the porch with Finda and the girls and told them that sometimes battles are not won by force but by refusing to be moved. He taught them a new line, "We hold, therefore we are." The daughters repeated it like a prayer. It was simple and true. Outside, the town breathed and waited. One morning a boy came running, breathless, with news. A ship had come in that morning with an old cane chest. The chest had belonged to Sori's father, the sailor who had left long ago. In the chest were letters and a small book of names. Sori opened the book with hands that trembled. The book had names of towns and a map of a life that traveled. There were lines written by a father who loved sea and children and had left to find a safer place. The letters told of a regret that tasted like salt and of a small coin sent every year. Sori read and found that his father had always wanted a son but had loved daughters too. The letters filled a gap like rain in dry soil. The letters changed something inward. Sori had carried the quiet of a man who misses a father, now he had instead the voice on paper who told him to be brave. He put the book on the porch and let the daughters read. Aminata read the sailors' names aloud while the twins traced the lines of ports with their fingers. The house filled with the smell of ink and the sound of places beyond the hills. The letters were a map that said, "You are not alone." People who had once mocked the house came to read the book. An old man from the market patted Sori on the back and said, "We are all sailors in our way." The town felt tighter. Kumba noticed the shift and came by, not with a pamphlet but with a tray of kola nuts. She sat and asked about the letters and Sori spoke the truth of a man who had been raised with the sea in his ears. He told of his father's dreams and how each daughter had been a reply to those dreams. Kumba listened and laughed once, not cruelly, and said, "Perhaps I was wrong long ago." Whether she said it to soften a heart or to save face, it did not matter. The porch had become a place where people could learn to change their minds. Change, like a seed, needs a place to grow. Then news came that the road project had a delay. Engineers found a problem with the bridge on the far side, money would have to be rerouted. The town breathed again. The garden kept its place. The market returned to its rhythm. Sori's daughters continued to teach, to trade, to mend. The town had not delivered a son to Sori, but it had given him something else, a small, hard group of neighbors who could not be moved by a stamp. The story had made its claim, slowly and steadily. The village began to speak of Sori not as a failure but as a man who made life possible in small ways. Kumba did not stop. Power is patient. She invited a political leader from the city council to a market lunch. The leader tasted the town's cassava and talked about development. He looked at the porch and then at his watch. He liked to move quickly. Kumba offered him plans and a sponsor. The leader liked plans that could be measured with a pen. He listened, and then he left with a promise that made the mayor shift his weight. Sori saw the leader's car and felt a small cold. The town's future always smelled different when a new car arrived. Sori's daughters watched the meeting from the porch. They felt the small threat gather. Sori told them to keep teaching, to keep the garden, to keep their list of names. He also told them to be brave if they had to sing in the face of men who carried promises. Aminata wrote a small petition. 80 people signed it. Mariama made a banner from old nets with words stitched in. Hawa went to neighboring towns and spoke with women who had been through the same fight. The twins ran errands and brought back stories from other porches where children learned. The movement built quietly. Then Kumba's people came early one morning with a stack of papers that said the town had voted for the road. The papers had stamps that looked real. They presented them with a smile like a blade wrapped in cloth. Sori took the papers, read them slowly, then held them up and said, "We want to see the tally." Kumba laughed at him. The market watched. Sori's courage was not a roar, it was a steady call. He asked the city man to delay until the tallies could be verified. The man hesitated, his charts had always worked before. This time, Doubt walked into the room with Sori's daughters and sat down like an unwanted guest. The town called for a recount and for witnesses. The mayor called elders and asked for truth. The truth in a small town is messy like a wet basket. People told of votes counted twice and of names that had been added after the meeting. Some were afraid to speak. Others were tired of the easy way. Sori's little movement had taught people to act. When the recount was done, the road's approval had been paused because numbers did not match. The city man left again with nothing but a promise to return. Kumba's smile narrowed. In the pause that followed, something else happened. A young woman named Mommy, who had been a market trader for 20 years, came forward with evidence. She had recorded the meeting on a small radio tape because she suspected Kumba might try to push the town aside. Mommy played the tape at the market circle and people heard voices that did not line up. The tape was not perfect, but it showed how the votes had been shifted. The market women who had once been silent stood up. They had their own memories and their own receipts. The town began to speak in a way that no longer feared the sound of its own truth. Kumba was furious and tried to accuse Mommy of theft. But the evidence had teeth. The mayor called the city office and the engineers. They asked for proof of signatures and cross-checks. That week the city man stayed longer. He called officials and checked maps. The road that Kumba had wanted could not begin without more investigations. The market breathed. Sori's daughters continued their work of teaching and healing. The town had discovered that small actions, like planting a garden, recording a meeting, teaching children to read, could make a system stop and check itself. Kumba did not give up. She decided to strike where stories hurt most, reputation. She spread a rumor that Sori's oldest daughter had taken a gift from a government man, a gift that included a small sum for the school. How could a teacher accept money? She asked. The rumor cut like a thin blade. People began to look again and to ask questions. Sori felt the sting. He went to the school and watched Aminata count the coins that were donations for books. There were records. He saw the honesty in her hands. He felt a fierce love that made his voice clear. Sori called a meeting and took out the ledger where Aminata had written every donation. The ledger smelled of paper and children. He read each line slowly and let the town hear the truth. The ledger was dry and thin and honest. People who had believed the rumor found it had no teeth. The town's anger turned on Kumba once more, not because Sori wanted it to but because truth had a living way of finding people who wanted justice. Kumba's arguments, which once had power like a knife, now sounded like a man repeating an old rumor. A time came when the mayor's office offered a small grant to any town that could show it had a community program for children. The grant was small but could build a real school. Kumba applied and Sori's porch applied too. The city officials would decide by visiting. The day the officials announced they would choose, the town was alive with nerves. Both sides worked hard. Kumba polished the market square and hired musicians. Sori's porch organized a demonstration of the children's learning. Aminata had the children recite letters and small stories. The twins performed a skit about a road that learned to listen. The city officials arrived with clipboards and polite faces. They walked the market, tasted cassava, and listened to speeches. They watched Kumba's team and counted the folded maps. Then they came to the porch. Children sang and read and showed their small drawings of a future that included both roads and gardens. The officials watched with an expression that was nearly curious, curiosity being a rare thing in city men with stamps. They asked questions about numbers and plans. Sori handed them a list of children and a small ledger of donations. He did not use big words. He used facts and faces. In the end, the grant went to Sori's porch. The officials said they were moved by the children. Kumba was furious, though she held her face like a mask. People cheered. The porch that had been mocked now had money for a real roof. They built a proper tin shed and a small blackboard. The market came together with small donations. The mayor praised the town. Sori looked at the roof and felt a quiet that was not quite victory but was better, it was progress. Kumba left town soon after, moving to a place where the council would not care what children read. Rumors said she had business in the city and new plans. People remembered her laughter but not all of her meanings. The market returned to its daily rhythm, with Sori's daughters doing their jobs. The porch became a place where young men and women came to learn to read and to plant. Families who once would not send daughters to school began to change. Parents thought, maybe daughters could be something else. But the world keeps asking hard questions. The sea took a fisherman one day far from shore, and the shipping office called Sori to say there would be fewer shipments. The town had to tighten again. Sori and his family learned new ways to be stubborn with joy. They had the roof, they had the school, and they had stories. More than that, they had each other. The town had changed, and the change was slow and good. There came a harvest festival when the town celebrated the sea and the land. Everyone brought their best. Sori's daughters made a float of net and flowers. Aminata read a story about a teacher who refused to believe that one name could define a person. The audience listened and clapped. The twins' song made old fishermen cry and little girls dance. The town's cameramen, young men who liked to film, shot a video of the festival and posted it in other towns. People watched and shared. The video showed the porch school, the small garden, the children's faces. Word traveled like wind. A reporter from the city came and asked Sori to tell the story for a wider paper. He wrote about a man who had daughters and how the daughters had saved the town. The article used simple phrases. It spoke of courage and of neighbors who had come together. The story went beyond the town like a bird crossing the sea. Messages came from places Sori had never been, invitations to speak, small donations, people saying they wished their own towns had a porch like his. The family learned that a story can grow wings. With wider eyes came wider choices. Aminata was offered a position in a larger school across the river that would pay better. Moriyama was asked to teach net mending at a coastal fair. Hawa received orders for sales from a fishing co-op. The twins were invited to a youth camp to tell stories. Decisions must be made in families. Sori and Finda sat together and listened. The house had always been a small map of choices. They decided to let each daughter go where she could help more people. They would keep the porch and the garden but send out a few seats to make more porches in other towns. The day of goodbyes was full of rice and laughter and old songs. People who had once scoffed now wished the family well. The market women embraced Aminata and told her to teach hard. Children left with chalk and notebooks. Sori stood at the gate and watched his daughters go like birds with steady wings. He felt a stone in his chest, not heavy like regret, but heavy like a promise kept. Finda held his hand and said, "Your daughters are the map you did not know you were drawing." Sori smiled and let the children move. Even as the daughters left, the porch remained. The twins kept the ledger and taught new children to read. Sori's laugh came often. People told a new story, that a man who loved his daughters might be the best thing a town can ask for. The saying moved through markets and into the mouths of children. It became a short song, Sori's girls carry the sun. The town began to believe it. Years kept moving like a slow drum. Sori grew older and his hair silvered at the temples. He walked slower but with a steadier step. The porch school had a small sign now and a tin roof that shone in the sun. Children came and left with chalk on their hands. Aminata wrote letters from the city that smelled of coffee and books. Moriyama sent photos of sails she had sewn. Hawa sent a parrot she had found at market and taught it a small song. The twins sent lists of things they wanted to grow in the garden. Sori kept every letter in a leather box by the door. One day, a young woman arrived with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She said, "My name is Cuddy and I was a student on the porch." She opened the bundle and showed a small rocking horse she had made with her own hands. She said, "I came back to teach sewing and to give thanks." People wept as they had before at weddings and births. The porch had become not just a place of learning but a place that sent people out and called them back. It made a path. Sorry watched this returning tide with a quiet that felt almost like wonder. He had once been a man who worried about his name and about what others would say. Now he had a house with a roof and a school that children loved. He had daughters who had left and made other porches. He had neighbors who would bring him yams in the rain. He had a town that had learned a new way to count value. Once, Kamba had mocked him, now, fewer people remembered her voice. Sorry felt the world tilt less and less. Then one evening, Sorry fell ill. It was not a large sickness but a slow one that made his feet tired and his words come out slower. The town came. The teacher across the river brought medicine. Aminata rushed with a bus ticket and Moriyama stopped her work to come home. The twins stayed by his bedside and told silly stories to make him laugh. Finda sat and held his hand and hummed a song about the sea. Children from the porch came and sang the letters he had taught them. The town surrounded him with small, practical love. This is how it should be, Sorry thought. Sorry lived long enough to see his daughter's children run under the porch and call him grandpa. He saw old men who had once mocked come and sit to listen to his stories and learn how to tie nets. He saw the mayor, now older, come to the porch with a new road plan that would try not to cut gardens. The town had grown wiser. Sorry found himself smiling more than he had in years and sleeping easier. He felt his life like a bowl nearly full. The day Sorry died, the town stopped in its tracks. It did not stop because some law said it must, but because a life had been a small, steady light and now the light had dimmed. People gathered at the porch where he had taught so many lessons. They told stories about him, how he once traded a mango for a book, how he had pulled a boy from the sea, how he had danced at a wedding and cried at a class. Aminata stood and read from his letters and from the little book his father had left. The twins told their lists and Tenji called each name of the children Sorry had taught. People wept like rivers. The market women wove a cloth of many colors for his burial. The mayor gave a speech that made few people clap but many nod. Old men spoke about how Sorry had forced them to be kinder and fewer voices shouted insults. The town decided to plant a baobab by the porch in his memory. They planted it with the same care that Sorry had used to protect his garden. The baobab would grow wide and bring shade for children who would one day read on its roots. After the funeral, life returned as life must. Children raced and markets hum and ships still came. But a new song lived in the town, a line that the children chanted, Sorry's daughters carry the sun. It became a proverb. It traveled to other towns, and sometimes young men heard it and looked different at girls who wanted to learn. The porch school kept running. The twins ran the ledger and taught children the way Sorry taught them, simple, patient, practical. Aminata opened a small library with books donated by townspeople who believed in the power of a pen. Moriyama trained more net menders. Hawa helped set up a small co-op so women could trade without fear. Sorry's story did not end with his death. It grew into other lives. His daughters grew older and their children learned to call him grandpa in the past tense. The baobab grew. The porch stood. The town had learned a truth it could not remember to forget, the value of daughters and the good men who love them. It was not the only truth, but it was a truth that changed many small things. Years later, a filmmaker from a distant city came to the town and asked to film a story about Sorry and his daughters. He found the porch, the baobab, and the small school with a tin roof that glinted in the sun. He spoke to Aminata and to the twins, who had grown into women with steady hands. He filmed children running, nets drying, and the small ledger sitting in the same corner where Sorry had kept it. He asked the town why Sorry had mattered. One old woman said simply, because he listened. The film spread and people in other towns watched. They saw Sorry's daughters teach and they saw the baobab grown wide. Young people from other small places came to learn to read and to fix nets. The founder's small porch inspired others to plant gardens and to keep corners for children. The proverb that had been a market's chant traveled like a seed, and other towns began to adopt porches as something sacred. The world outside changed as well. People began to think that a man could be measured not by sons but by kindness and by the way he helped daughters to fly. The story of Sori Kamara became almost a small legend. It was told at festivals and read in schools. People quoted his lines about daughters carrying the sun and taught them to their children. Sori's name lived like a song. Yet, legends often lose the small details that make them human. The true power of the story stayed in the little things: a ledger with neat handwriting, a net with repaired knots, a child's drawing pinned on a board. Those small things were the proof. And in the town, the baobab's leaves whispered on windy days about a man who had no son and had more than 1,000 small futures. When a child asked why they planted the tree, the teacher would point to the porch and say, "Because someone once decided that daughters are worth the world." The child would touch the bark and feel a roughness that was good to hold. What remains is not a single moment but many small ones stitched together. A girl learning to read, a net mended in a night, a market woman who found a new trade. These are the threads of a life. Sori's was a life of small things that grew large when people paid attention. The town kept telling his story, not because it wanted fame but because it wanted to remind itself of what is possible. The porch school continued to teach children to read the sea and the sky. If you go to that town and sit under the baobab, you might hear a child reciting letters while the market sells fish and soap. You might hear an old woman singing a song about names. You will see girls with tools and boys with chalk. You will see a sign on the porch that reads, simply, "Here we teach." The sign was not there because someone wanted to shout but because someone wanted to hold a truth. And sometimes, when the moon is bright, an old melody returns. Children sing about a man named Sori who bought 2 extra mangoes at market and hid them in his pockets for his daughters. They sing about how he cut a goat free from a tree and turned a village's insult into a feast. They sing that names do not make people small and that a life is measured by what a person gives away. This is how the story stays alive, not as a single great deed, but as many small, stubborn acts of kindness. The town tells the story again and again. It is not a perfect story. It does not end with one clean triumph. There are still arguments and new challenges. But the town has learned a way to measure a man that is different and, perhaps, better. When asked what is the most important thing in the story, the children will say, without thinking, "Love your daughters." The adults will say, "Teach them." And the elders will nod and say, "And hold a porch."